So, and now we're being recorded. So I've spent a lot of time doing sort of big Colorado River issues. Pretty familiar with that stuff. I can talk about that a lot. Probably not the stuff you want to hear today, although I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I think talking to Mandy, she was really more curious about what shortages on the Colorado River might mean to here in the Animas River, which I can give you the short upfront answer is don't really know yet. I can explain that a little bit, but certainly everybody watching the news sees that everybody's been talking about a shortage in the lower basin of the Colorado River has been declared for 2022. It's a big deal, right? At least the lower basin think it's a big deal because it's the first time it's ever happened. Up here in the upper basin, we keep reminding people that we have shortages every year. Somewhere in the basin, because of Mother Nature doesn't deliver enough water to us to provide all the water to all of our water users, we have shortages every year. So that's the message we keep wanting folks to hear in the upper basin, is that we always have shortages. What that means specifically here in Animas, if we end up having what's declared a curtailment in the upper basin, if we can't deliver enough water to the lower basin, we could have to curtail our water users here in the upper basin. It's never happened before, and how that may happen is like I said, is kind of a question mark. We don't really know yet. The two things that we need to think about really are, first of all, the state of Colorado is undergoing compact administration rules right now. They're trying to develop the rules that would be implemented if that ever happened. We don't know what those rules look like yet. Kevin Ryan, the state engineer, is starting up in the Yampa Basin. We'll have public meetings down here probably this spring to try and outline or define how an interstate regulation might occur, how much water. Relative to Southwest, one thing we are trying to work on, if people are familiar with a risk study that was done a couple years ago that outlined how much water the west slope in Colorado may have to contribute under a curtailment. Trying to think, it happened about 2 years ago. We had the risk study. We have some numbers for Southwest Colorado, generally speaking, of how much water we might have to contribute. But we don't know how that water might be how much water from each of the subbasins within Southwest, or the Dolores, the Animas, the San Juan. So one thing we're working on here in Southwest right now is really trying to define, if we had to start cutting water uses on the Colorado River, how much each of those subbasins might have to contribute. It's going to take probably a year of modeling and working with a lot of the local water users. So that's what we're working on right now. So again, happy to answer any questions. I think the big thing is it's sort of a moving target right now. We're trying to figure out what shortages on the Colorado might mean in the Animas. Hopefully we'll have better answers in the next year or two. Again, a lot of issues going on in the Colorado right now. Happy to try and answer questions, big river issues. I didn't know how much of the big river sort of topics you might want to get into. So hopefully maybe we can have a little more of discussion and answer questions, some more specific questions you might have.
Thank you, Steve. This is Paul Montoya. Can you hear me?
Hi, Paul. How you doing? Yep.
I am off the charts, I'll tell you. What I was interested in knowing is, do you think the shortages you're talking about will be shared or negotiated across the board, or do you think it'll be more like some kind of an agreement that specifically picks on a certain basin?
Well, I think that's a good question. As you may or may not know, if the upper basin had to curtail its water uses, the Upper Colorado River Commission, which basically is the 4 upper basin states, would assign a volume of water to each state, right, that they had to curtail. So Colorado would be assigned X amount of acre feet that we had to cut our water uses. Now, how that curtailment would impact Colorado or be distributed across Colorado is certainly up in the air. I mean, I think the easy way to do it is look at priority dates of your water rights and just start cutting people back on those dates. But if you do that, certain bases that didn't develop as quickly as others, Southwestern being one of them, might be sort of inequitably have to cut more water than some other basins because we didn't develop as quick. I think you hear a lot about in the demand management discussion the state's having, just the quote of equitable and fair apportionment of a curtailment. So that is certainly part of what Kevin Ryan in his compact administration rules was talking about. Whether we try and cut more based on a fair apportionment in each basin and what that might look like versus on a straight priority system. So great question. That's part of the conversation that's ongoing right now, how we might get to those volumes of water and how that would be distributed across each sub-basin on the western slope.
Well, the one I'm familiar with down here in New Mexico is that we agreed to everybody taking a certain percentage cut if there was a declaration of shortage declared, so that everybody at least got some water and not anybody would be totally left out in a priority system. So that was kind of my question that I was trying to get at from a more fair way. And maybe it would be like within a basin itself that they would decide their apportionment is X, and then each one would take X minus a half or a quarter or a third or whatever to meet that requirement. And the basin would agree upon that to meet that apportionment.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I think in Colorado, we just haven't come to that agreement yet of how that might happen. And again, the state engineer is trying to figure out sort of what authorities he has or doesn't have currently to do something other than a straight priority date regulation and make that sort of disperse some of those impacts across the basin. Just as a point, anybody who's curtailed, anybody who has a water right pre-compact, which is probably about a 1922 water right, will not be impacted by a curtailment. It's only the post-22 water rights that will be cut. So you need to look at how those post-1922 water rights were developed, across the west slope of Colorado, who had some of the earlier ones, who had the later ones, and who might be most impacted by sort of a priority regulation. And again, certainly part of the conversation goes to some of the big front range water users who have a lot of trans-mountain diversions on the west slope. They have pretty late water rights, typically 40s, 50s, and 60s. So they would be turned off or potentially turned off, and they would much rather see more of a percentage cut than a priority regulation cut. So it's all part of the discussion right now, and just don't have any really good answers. Something we're working on.
Marcia, I think you raised your hand first, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, Steve, thanks. This is really helpful. Thank you. How, and if this isn't figured out, that's fine, but what is the role of the roundtables and the CWCB and the state engineer? Is it who has the final decision? And the legislature, for that matter. I mean, has it been figured out who will finally decide no matter the methodology?
Okay, well, let's start with CWCB. The director of the CWCB, Becky Mitchell, she's Colorado's commissioner to the Upper Colorado River Commission. The Upper Colorado River Commission is the one that sort of oversees the Upper Basin Compact. That commission has 5 members, 1 from each of the Upper Basin states, and then a federal chair, although that federal chair seat is currently empty. So on the interstate side, certainly Becky and her staff have a lot of say-so in what's going on. But when it comes to administering those water rights within the state of Colorado, ultimately that's going to fall to Kevin Ryan and his staff because they're in charge of the water administration. So certainly Kevin and Becky and their staffs talk a lot. Becky's been very inviting to both Andy Mueller and myself at the 2 river districts on the West Slope, keeping us updated on those conversations. So it will be a party of folks, but certainly ultimately, I think it's going to fall to Becky and Kevin to make those decisions.
Sorry, go ahead, Marcel.
Awesome. Thanks for that overview, Steve. I don't think I've ever heard it described or articulated so succinctly. So I really appreciate that. It's a really complicated issue, and you railed it off in like a few paragraphs. It's really impressive. One thing that I'd like to just see if you have a perspective on talking about this really massive deficit that we're in across really the whole Colorado River Basin, millions of acre feet of deficit. One of the things that has been a head scratcher for me, and I think other river keepers, is we have this big deficit, a big hole, and yet there are still lots of plans to develop more water out of the upper basin, which would be digging a deeper hole into the deficit. And I wonder what your perspective might be on that. Since the water district, for example, holds some of those rights, and so do municipalities kind of all over the region. Just want to see what you think. Well,
so that's a very complex topic and question, right? We could talk hours about it. Originally, the compact said both the upper and lower basin had 7.5 million acre feet to develop, right? Roughly. I mean, there's lots of complexities about that. The lower basin has developed 7.5 million acre feet, and they can currently actually consume somewhere between 8.5 to 10 million acre feet every year. In the upper basin, though theoretically we had 7.5 million, we've only developed about 4.5. So the question becomes, should we be cutting our ability to develop when we haven't even reached what was promised us? And you know, you can argue both sides of that issue, right? The system as a whole and what was promised politically. I agree, some of the bigger development projects in the upper basin that are being proposed are problematic. And I think they are going to be discussed over the next 5 years with great intensity of how when we renegotiate the new guidelines on the operations. So again, you can look at it, hey, we have a right to develop, but it certainly doesn't mean the water will be there. And certainly there are problems that it will cause if we try and keep pushing for some of those. So it's part of the complex discussions that are going to be occurring over the next 5 years. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful questions. Are there any further questions? I think we might move on and stay a little ahead of time, which is great. Next, I would like to invite Peter Butler to speak about the Bonita Peak Mining District update in the Upper Animas. And hopefully Anthony Edwards will join us in time.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
You can hear me all right, I assume? Okay, great. So a couple things I want to update people on. I think Marcel has given some updates at different meetings for the community forum. But I'm going to give a little background just in case some of you haven't been paying as much attention as some of us have. The Upper Animas Basin, of course, there's been a lot of work in the Upper Animas Basin for many years. There's been almost 30 years of study and of work to try to figure out how to improve water quality, and a number of mine remediation projects during that time frame. Mostly that was done through a process called the Animas River Stakeholders Group. And there were about 60 mine remediation projects that were completed before this ever became a Superfund site was ever designated up in the Upper Basin. The Animas River Stakeholders Group couldn't address some of the real problematic sites, the ones particularly dealing with draining mines, the liability issues, the kind of long-term maintenance that's needed, the financial commitment that's needed, were really kind of beyond the capacity of the Animas River Stakeholders process. And the Superfund process, of course, is a much bigger, much more well-funded process. That came in, of course, after a year after the Gold King spill. The thing about the Superfund process is that it's a very kind of linear, very step-by-step type of process that takes a lot of time to work through all those steps, takes a lot of information gathering. And really one of the top priorities, I think, in Superfund is that agencies, particularly EPA, they want to be very sure of what they're doing. They take a very long long-term approach to studying things in great detail, and want to work very hard and not making any mistakes along the way, and make sure they've really investigated everything as well as possible. The other part of Superfund, of course, is the cost recovery portion of it. Under Superfund, EPA can spend a great deal of money doing work at a Superfund site, and then come back to what is referred to as PRPs, potential responsible parties, and try to recover those costs. And so as a result, they want to take a lot of time in documenting everything and making sure that all their decisions, if they're litigated, will stand up in court. And so that means that a great deal of money is spent on consultants, on attorneys, on documentation of everything they do, and they move very slowly because of that. In fact, that was one of the reasons for the Animas River Stakeholders Group. The idea was to not have a lot of money spent on attorneys and consultants, and try to put more money into actually doing projects on the ground. So the Superfund process, EPA has been moving very methodically. They have not done any other than treating the Gold King mine, which they began a year before the Superfund process started. They really haven't done anything that would dramatically improve water quality other than treating the Gold King. Treating the Gold King is certainly helping. Also, they released the Superfund site was designated 5 years ago. They released a 5-year plan this spring, which the Bonita Peak commented quite extensively on. And in that plan, they had nothing in that plan that said that they were going to do any other types of projects that would substantially improve water quality over the next 5 years. And that was something that was a little disturbing to us. They have actually been doing a lot of work in investigations. They've been doing this summer. They've done quite a bit of what I would refer to as more maintenance type of work. They've gone to a number of different sites which had drainage ponds in front of the draining adits, and have cleaned out those ponds. And basically to make sure that there's room in those ponds so that they can it'll take more water and more sludge that might develop over time and not overflow. They've spent quite a bit of time and effort developing plans for a repository, a site-wide repository. That repository would handle all the sludge that's being generated at the Gold King mine, and it would also handle a lot of mine waste that they may remove in other places around the basin. That particular repository would be built on tailings pond number 4, which is a large open space. It's, I don't know, something like 20 acres or so of flat open space. There's not a lot of flat open space in San Juan County to put a repository. And so they're putting a lot of resources into developing that, making sure that that repository is properly sited and properly planned, and that it will be adequate for holding waste in the perpetual future. Other types of projects that are going on, there's been kind of a lot of drilling that has gone on in the upper basin. EPA drilled some pretty long, extensive wells down towards the American Tunnel to be able to monitor water levels and water quality between bulkheads in the American Tunnel and in another area to monitor the water table. Sunnyside Gold has spent an enormous amount of money doing a lot of drilling on the tailings ponds themselves. The tailings ponds are a potential source of metal loading. Sunnyside is trying to better characterize those ponds. They've been working cooperatively with EPA in doing so. I think they've spent somewhere on the order of about $12 million in studying those tailings ponds over the past 5 years. EPA's also drilled behind some other mines where there's been collapses at the entrance. Particularly, they've been trying to get into the Bandora, and they've also opened up the Terry Tunnel. The reason for drilling behind a collapse in a mine is sometimes the entrance will collapse and will back up water, and you want to be able to remove some of that water if you're going to open it up beforehand, so you don't just have a large release, which is what happened with the Gold King spill. So they've been drilling in a couple places to be able to open up mines. They have had a strong interest in opening up entrances where they can get into mine tunnels that have bulkheads that have been covered up basically by closing up the front end of the mine. They want to be able to get into the bulkheads and inspect those bulkheads and make sure they're still working adequately and make sure that they don't look like they're degrading. So they've spent quite a bit of effort doing that. Other things that have been going on in the upper basin, both Forest Service and BLM have also been doing some work at particular sites. Again, I'd characterize most of it as kind of more maintenance type of work, channeling water away from mine sites, cleaning up kind of debris around mine sites. BLM did clean up one tailings pile, remediate one pile. EPA remediated one tailings pile as well, or tailings area at the Kitty Mac when they did their, where they put some of their waste. So those are kind of some of the main activities that have been going on. A lot of study, a lot of sampling. A lot of seeps and springs were sampled all around the Gladstone area in particular. That was done by MSI as contractors to EPA. So there's been, while there hasn't been projects that have done a lot to improve water quality, there has been a lot of work been going on, a lot of characterization work and a lot of what I refer to as kind of more maintenance work on a number of these different sites. So I also want to talk a little bit about what the CAG itself does. The CAG, the Bonita Peak CAG, CAG is a community advisory group, and community advisory groups are recognized under Superfund law. Our Bonita Peak CAG is recognized by EPA as a CAG for this Superfund site. We usually meet monthly via Zoom. And we provide a lot of comments and information to EPA. Those meetings provide a forum so people can understand what's going on month to month in the basin. The CAG is starting to try to do a little more outreach. We have a website. We've had that all along since we began the CAG. We gave a tour to the La Plata County Commissioners last month, and one San Juan County Commissioner joined us as well. And I think that was really helpful to the commissioners to kind of get your feet on the ground and see what's going on in the basin. And I think we'd like to do more of that. The CAG has also been collecting water quality samples down in the Animas Canyon. So the Animas Canyon, I refer to the Animas Canyon as the canyon between Silverton and Baker's Bridge, essentially. And there's been a lot of data collection at each end of the canyon. Right below Silverton, there's been monthly data, water quality data has been collected there since about 1992 or so. The Baker's Bridge, there's been monthly water quality data has been collected there since about 98, although there was, or actually more like 95, I think. There was a little hiatus of 4 years in there. So there's a great deal of data on each ends of that canyon, but not much data in the middle of the canyon. And the reason for that is the difficulty in getting in there. It takes a lot of time and effort to get in there to sample. And so the Bonita Peak CAG decided we'll just volunteer to hike in and collect samples. There is a grant that is administered by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment that's paying for processing those samples. And so we hike in monthly down into Cascade, down the creek, down the trail from Purgatory down to Cascade Creek. And then in the wintertime, we've been riding the train. The train goes in the wintertime and turns around at the Y and lets the tourists off for about half an hour or so. And that gives us enough time to go grab a sample. And then we've also been collecting samples down below Elk Park, actually about a third of a mile below where Elk Creek meets the Animas River. And that's a pretty long hike too. We hike down from Molas Pass down the Colorado Trail and then hike down the tracks about 1.5 miles to get those samples. And this past winter, because there was so little snow, we actually skied down the tracks from Silverton, and we got samples every month in the wintertime, except for February when there's a little too much snow. That data I think is very helpful. It's showing that conditions in the canyon are, water quality conditions are actually probably the worst in probably February, March, April, in that kind of time frame. That's not a time frame that EPA generally samples upstream, up in the Animas Basin. They generally sample, they mostly sample in June and in September. In September, they use as their low flow month, but actually water quality is much worse later in the year or beginning of the next year. So I think that data has actually been very helpful. The other activity that the CAG is undertaking is we have a draft proposal for changing water quality standards on the upper part of Mineral Creek. So this is the stretch between where Mill Creek comes into Mineral Creek. And that's kind of near where that big, huge horseshoe curve is when you're heading up Red Mountain Pass. So from there downstream, kind of a short distance to where the road starts up to towards Overpass, down by where the Middle Fork comes into Mineral Creek. That section of the river has improved dramatically over the past 20, 25 years in terms of water quality. There's been over a dozen projects, minor remediation projects upstream of that section. We have seen reductions in copper about 95% in copper concentrations and about 70% reduction in cadmium and zinc concentrations in that stretch of river. So that's a really kind of the biggest success area that we've seen in the upper Animas Basin in terms of improving water quality. The water quality standards there are basically the same as they were since 2001, 20 years ago. And those water quality standards are based upon there not being any aquatic life whatsoever there. They're based upon no aquatic life. And so what we would like to do is to add a aquatic life, what's called a use classification, to signify that that segment does support aquatic life. And that aquatic life is trout, brook trout. EPA found brook trout, much to our surprise and everyone else's surprise. They found brook trout there in about 2015, 2016. There's also very good macroinvertebrates in that particular section. And so that section is supporting, clearly is supporting aquatic life. And under the Clean Water Act, that aquatic life use should be protected. In general, most of the metals, most of the water quality parameters are quite good in that section. They meet what's referred to as table value standards by the state of Colorado. Those are standards that are protective of 95% of all aquatic life that you would expect to see in a stream. And except for really cadmium and zinc, all those standards are met. And then lead and copper are kind of marginal. They're kind of right there at the edge of meeting at those table value standards. And so our proposal would be to propose table value standards for almost all parameters except for cadmium and zinc. And we're still trying to figure out what's the best approach to looking at cadmium and zinc, because we're not sure that those particular metals can ever meet aquatic life standards there, even if there's more mine remediation done in that stretch. So those are kind of the basic activities, what the CAG's doing. I think that gives you a little bit of a sense of what is going on in the Bonita Peak Superfund site area. And I'll kind of follow Steve's lead and see if there's some questions and see if we can have a little bit of discussion if that helps people. Anyone have any questions?
Please feel free to use the hand raise function if that's helpful.
Well, I talked fast and furious. I didn't, maybe people didn't quite pick up enough to be able to ask good questions.
Sorry. Peter, I appreciate, that you're covering a lot of ground and that there's a lot of different organizations working up in this area. And you covered a lot of folks are working on different things and describing what the CAG has been up to recently. And I really appreciate showing that sometimes when we talk about the upper watershed or talk about the Superfund site, there can be a lot of assumptions that not enough has happened, not as many good things are happening, but I think it's really nice to hear that that there have been significant improvements, not only from way back when with all the work that the Animas River Stakeholders Group has done, but also, this new motion that that the CAG is putting together to try and make sure that these water quality standards that we have guiding protections of these river segments are updated and matching the conditions that we're seeing on the ground.
To add on to that a little bit, EPA developed some goals for the Superfund site. And some of the main goals deal with water quality, improving water quality. There's also goals of preventing unexpected releases like the Gold King release. And that's part of the reason for some of the drilling that they're doing to potentially open up some of these mines. And that's also part of the reason, the rationale for mucking out some of these ponds before the draining mines. So there isn't sudden overflows of those ponds with a lot of kind of nasty metals. The other goal is to do kind of maintenance type of work to keep there from being erosion from a lot of these mine waste sites as well. But in terms of the water quality, because I think that's the kind of most significant issue, there are 4 segments that EPA identified where they thought that they could improve aquatic life. And those 4 segments are the South Fork of Mineral Creek, the section of Mineral Creek that I referred to earlier that the Bonita Peak CAG is looking to change water quality standards on. The other 2 sections are the Animas River below Silverton. That's kind of the main priority section where also, again, the CAG is doing a lot of monitoring. And then the section of the Animas River upstream from Cement Creek on up to about Eureka. And so those are kind of the 4 areas where EPA hopes to improve aquatic life. And I think that most people would agree that those are the areas where there could be some improvement, and there is already some aquatic life in all 4 of those areas. So in terms of standards, we're looking to address one of those areas where there has been big improvements. The South Fork of Mineral Creek already has high water quality standards applied to it. I don't see there any reason to change those. Then the segments of the Animas above Cement Creek and then below Silverton, there's still a lot of questions as to what can be done there, particularly related to mine tailings in that section upstream of Silverton. And I think that there's a broad enough questions there as to what improvements can be made that certainly a lot more investigation needs to be done. And that is an area that EPA is looking into much more closely, really beginning this summer. They're drilling into a lot of those tailings. The other area where there could be substantial improvements, of course, is up in the Gladstone area. That's really where most of the metals, that's the biggest source area of metals. And there used to be a treatment plant there. And fortunately, we have water quality data from when there was a full-blown treatment plant there in the early 2000s. And so we do have a good sense of how much that would improve water quality down in the river below Silverton. Nobody wants to build a large treatment plant and have to run it in perpetuity. And so there's efforts to try to figure out ways to reduce those sources without doing that. But we know what types of improvements can be made. And we also have a pretty good sense of what type of improvements may not be feasible either. There's a lot of sections of river up there where you're not going to have aquatic life, or you're going to have minimal aquatic life just because of a lot of the natural loading. So we have an advantage over a lot of other Superfund sites in that there was already a lot of work that had been done in this site, and already a great deal has been known about this particular site.
Peter, this is Paul Montoya again. And are you still looking for members for your CAG?
Right now we have, we do have a full, the CAG, we have 15 members and all 15 slots are filled, but we're always interested, people do come and go off the CAG. So if there's, particular people who you think would be good, please let me know. And I'll mention too that when the initial CAG started, Paul was one of our CAG members. But yeah, Paul, if you've got some people, some names you want to send me, that would be great. I'll keep them in the back of my mind.
Well, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to promote joining the CAG for the benefits of the area. And you've done a great job on that. I really appreciate it. And I'm sorry I couldn't continue on the CAG for a longer period of time.
Well, thanks, Paul. And we really appreciate having a New Mexico voice on the CAG as well.
At this time, if there aren't any more specific questions for Peter, I'd like to invite Anthony Edwards, who is the communications liaison for the Bonita Peak Mining District, to speak as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. I sit on the CAG and the far corner, I would say, and then, but I also sit on the Bonita Peak, the local planning group up here in Silverton, and that comes through WIN funding and work with the tribes and states downstream all the way to Lake Powell. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, and then if anybody has any questions, just to give an idea. The planning group was when the San Juan County had requested originally for Superfund, which the Governor Hickenlooper at the time required that the local community request Superfund. We asked for many things, some similar to what the CAG wanted as well. And in a nutshell, to have a seat at the table to meet with the land management agencies. The Forest Service and BLM collectively own 85% of the county, and actually have some of the sites that, and Peter may have mentioned it earlier, but have mixed use in some of these sites, including the American Tunnel. Anyway, I think when the planning group just asked for this. The idea was that we could sit down and talk about the activities in the county and make sure they weren't going to interfere with summer visitation and other things, and make sure that we keep things safe when big equipment's moving through, sludge was moving through, and that gives you kind of an idea why the local planning group might have some things that are different than maybe the CAG, the Community Advisory Group. We have a lot of similarities, work closely together. I think Peter would agree that we're really usually very on point, 90+% of the time, what we're all working towards, and we meet collectively many times on the bigger issues. In regards to the WIN, that really stems from the Gold King funds, or excuse me, the Gold King spill, and the funding was for the tribes and the states to start to work together, to monitor together, and we've moved into, this comes at approximately $4 million a year. It looks like it's going to continue on for the foreseeable future to be able to do 319 projects or even 104 projects by the EPA. There's funding through the EPA in a process they're putting together to fund projects up and down the watershed. And those projects can be, those funds can go to nonprofits, can go to different organizations, watershed groups, to help improve the watershed, and it goes well beyond minerals. It can go to nutrient loading, other things. So we're really excited. I say we're really excited that the people involved in the environmental community on the tribes and states are really excited that we can try to bring these funds in to our partners in the watershed. I think I'll leave it at that. If there's any questions, and definitely feel free to contact me offline as well if you'd like to discuss either of those programs.
Thanks, Anthony. Does anyone have any specific questions for Anthony or Peter as well? We are still ahead of time. So if you have something on your mind, please come forward. But otherwise, we can move to the next speaker on our agenda, which is Jason Lahan. And I invite you to share your screen and present your slides. Thank you very much, Peter and Anthony. Really appreciate that presentation. Thanks.
All right, are you seeing slides now?
Yep, you can see your slide.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay. On my end, it's not showing up. There we go. So thank you for inviting me to speak with your group today. My name is Jason Lahan. I'm with the San Juan National Forest. And I think looking at the audience, some of you are familiar with the Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative, but several may not be as familiar. So I was going to give some high-level context about what it is and how we ended up here in Southwest Colorado. And then we can go into some of the details of kind of what we're doing here locally that may involve many of you, hopefully. So the kind of, it all started with fire. Fire is the primary threat. You all are familiar and experienced with fire. You've seen these headlines locally, you've seen them across the state. We've had, I believe, nearly every one of our largest and most destructive fires in Colorado's history have all happened in the last 10 years. And last year was a banner year in terms of breaking all kinds of records for fire in the state. And it's not even on this map. So if you look at this map, this what you're seeing first in the red is the historic fires up to 2018. So again, there's a whole bunch more of these big red blobs statewide after last year. This season wasn't as bad, but definitely was a big one the year before. You're also looking at brown at the areas of insects and disease outbreak. And then purple is the areas of projected population growth. And so what we've got in terms of the problem is not only do we have the fires becoming larger, more destructive, having more impact to the things we care about, But combined with insects and disease and population growth, we've really got ourselves into a situation where we don't have the resources to operate at the scale needed. As of kind of the projection on average that this was taken, we were having about 400,000 acres a year being impacted by wildfire and insects. And we were, as the U.S. Forest Service, as the kind of largest forested landowner in the state, we were only treating 30 to 40,000 acres a year. So think about that in terms of context. We're operating at 30 to 40,000 acres a year of mitigation work, and over our nearly 400,000 acres a year being impacted. That's being compounded again with the population growth, because in Colorado, only 25% of the wildland urban interface, that's the area where vegetative kind of communities interact with our infrastructure, with our homes, with our towns. And only 25% of that is developed. And so as we get more and more people coming to our state and coming to our community here in the Southwest, where those issues become compounded because we have more and more people moving to where the fire becomes an issue even more because of those structures. Doing the work becomes harder, more demands on water, more demands on recreation. All of these things kind of exponentially grow more challenging and difficult to manage. So the shared stewardship strategy was released late 2018. It came out of the Department of Agriculture and the Chief of the Forest Service. And it was really looking at these three elements you're seeing here, where it recognized that we weren't getting to the pace and scale commensurate with the threat of fires and kind of the issues we were dealing with. And that individually, we just didn't have the resources as one agency to do this, and nor did it only impact us. Many times, many years, over half of our fires are occurring on state and private lands, and so it's not just a Forest Service issue. And so, how do we look at things across all lands, and how do we prioritize in places with our partners working together so that we can develop strategies and work at a scale that's commensurate with that threat? And if we can't work everywhere, that means we have to do a lot of prioritization and make a lot of difficult decisions along the way. And so later in 2019, the National Wild Turkey Federation, for those that aren't familiar with that group, they're a conservation organization that's been a partner with the Forest Service for a very long time, been very successful in conservation and habitat improvement efforts back east, and have a presence all over the West, but they really were looking to expand their footprint and wanted to work with the U.S. Forest Service on tackling this issue under shared stewardship. And so they conceived the idea of the Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative and identified Colorado as a potential place for a pilot where we could co-convene and look at how we could do things differently. How do we work with folks to do this kind of a process? So Colorado was chosen. We brought together natural resource leaders from across the state and the country. And we started from ground zero, really, is what are the shared values? We aren't all going to be working on everything in the same way and in the same places, but what is that shared space? Those four values were recreation, resilient communities, forests and wildlife habitat, and water, which obviously this group is very interested in. Water as a primary focus. So then we looked across the landscapes and we went out across the state and again gathered more people in local landscapes to ask if they agreed with these challenges, if they saw these issues the same way. And 3 landscapes were identified for kind of this group to think about focusing their collective investments. That's the Southwest Colorado, the Upper South Platte, and the Arkansas Headwaters. And so this is just kind of a look at some of the partners. It started with the Forest Service and the National Wild Turkey Federation, and then moved and expanded, and it continues to grow. And when you start adding in how many local partners we have, this number is much, much larger. So kind of this is kind of the high level state kind of organization that is the Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative. It's focused on those 4 values. It has 4 subcommittees. So wood utilization, funding subcommittee, workforce capacity, and social license. Those were identified as kind of the primary barriers that collaboratives and groups across the state are really all struggling with. And then those 3 landscapes that I mentioned before. And so that's kind of the structure of RMRI as a whole in Colorado. And now we're going to dive into Southwest Colorado. And just to mention here, this is a really big deal because Southwest Colorado was identified unanimously as the #1 priority landscape in the state by this group of natural resource leaders that included the state forester, the regional forester, the NRCS state conservationist, BLM, TNC, National Fish and Wildlife Federation, you name it. There's a whole list of state natural resource leaders that identified Southwest Colorado as being a really important place that we need to focus on work. So for the Southwest Colorado partners, they came together, put in a proposal. Obviously, we're very successful in being identified as that priority. And the vision is really, you can see, complementary to those 4 values and to the 2 groups like yourself in terms of water resources. And so I'm not going to read those specifically, but these are this is the kind of vision statements, the high level view of where we're trying to go to really be ready for that next wildfire. I guess if I was to summarize kind of what the goal is that the next time we have 100,000 acre fire here, and we will, we want to be ready for it, and specifically we want to protect those resources we care about most: water, our communities, our wildlife and forest habitat, and our recreation opportunities, because that's really what makes this place unique and what makes Southwest Colorado special. So starting to dive in at a local landscape, the area that we identified, and I'll show you a map in a second, it's about 750,000 acres, and so it's still very big. And we have to start focusing in on how do we gather input in more depth and come up with a strategy. So we needed a way to break down the map. We needed to figure out how to assess those values across that map. And then we needed to prioritize those locations locally with partners. So this is the area that was identified as that boundary. It's really the corridor along 160 from Bayfield up through to Dolores, where the majority of the wildland urban interface overlaps with water, where we have a lot of our front country recreation and some critical habitat areas. And so it's that area where we think we can have an influence and do the most good to kind of move towards these big picture goals and objectives. The group then we needed to establish a governance structure, and so we developed the steering committee. The steering committee here in Southwest Colorado is made up of 5 agency representatives. That's the Kara, who's on, the forest supervisor for the San Juan National Forest, the BLM, NRCS, and Colorado State Forest Service, and then National Wild Turkey Federation as the co-convening partner with us, and then 1 member representing each of those core values. And so we have a representative, Aaron Kimple, that's on from Mountain Studies Institute representing communities, Mike Preston representing water, and Matt Thorpe representing Colorado Parks and wildlife issues, and then Amy Schwartzbaugh from City of Durango representing recreation. So a really good group of kind of with diverse interests thinking about how to do that. We weighted those values, and water overwhelmingly 30% came out as the #1 priority in terms of if you think about scaled interests. If you don't have water, then you don't have communities, then you may not have recreation. And so there's a lot of these things that kind of weigh off on one another. And it's not that anything isn't important, but we needed to weight them so that we knew kind of where we stood in terms of really getting into the prioritization. We also tried to integrate the different prioritization and tools that were out there from what the Dolores Watershed and Resilient Forest Collaborative had done, what the Four Rivers Collaborative had done. The Forest Service had its own highly valued resources and assets analysis. We have county input, we have experts. And so the way that we wanted to do that was to basically identify a shared map and start asking people and being able to input where those core values were most at risk, regardless of kind of which tool you use to actually model where or why they were a priority. And so we took all that input and we put it into pods. And pods is just an acronym. We use government, so we need to use acronyms, right? But it's potential operational delineations. And for the purpose of this, we could have used counties, we could have used watersheds at some HUC level, but these potential operational delineations really suited us well, both in terms of their size and that these boundaries are identified because fire experts and fire managers have identified these as the highest likelihood of success for managing a fire should we get one in that unit. So if you're looking here at Dolores 4, those red lines around it are areas where fire managers have said this is a change in vegetation type, a major road, somewhere that a fire would most likely would be the best spot to try and hold a fire, rather than trying to hold a fire in a spot that we may not have a high probability of success, or we would have to do a lot of damage to be successful. This pods process is also science-based in terms of risk transfer. And so there's a lot of other inputs that can go into this and be utilized once we start using pods in terms of how risk of fire and how it's transferred across the landscape. And so they can build on one another. And the group decided that would be a really good way to break down the landscape. We then invited stakeholders to participate. We specifically invited 167. The estimate from the local collaboratives was that it was probably over 300 when it was all said and done. Of those, we had about 87 who actually participated in it, and then representing 46 different organizations in Southwest Colorado. Here's the organizations that were involved. And then we got this amazing amount of comments. So we asked people to not only say in pod 27, is this a priority for water? Is this a priority for recreation? We asked people to comment as well, and we got over 1,700 comments. And this isn't like a NEPA comment process. This is, this reservoir in pod 27 is an extreme priority because it's the drinking source water for Bayfield. And we were able to get a lot of that other qualitative data to combine with those rankings to really kind of refine our product. So we have these examples for each of the 4 values. I highlighted water for this group, but some of the outputs of what that looks like is then we see both where on the landscape, if you were just looking at water, would be the highest priorities based on that input. You can also look at it by group. So I mentioned the steering committee. Each of those steering committee members identified subject matter experts in water and recreation and wildlife, and that's what the SMEs group is. So you can see where their rankings came out, and then you can see the local collaboratives and where theirs came out, or all combined. And then you can also look at it in an integrated way. So we're both looking at trying to look cross-boundary, but also cross-program. And so you can see on this map in terms of the stars, the big stars those are the top priority for water, communities, wildlife, and recreation. But then the small stars mean that they're also within the top 10. And so you can see some of those like Columbine 36, kind of in that north central area, that's a priority across the board for 4 values where you could do really good integrated work, as well as addressing high priority areas. So it really is a way for us to kind of start to refine and develop strategies in a very localized way, but with input from a really broad group of stakeholders looking at first interest. So we know both where we can go if we want to just focus on a water priority, or if we wanted to look at the best opportunity for integrated outcomes, we can do that as well. So the next step of really where we're trying to go with this is developing our kind of local strategies in these pods. And these are just examples. We have a subset that we've identified that we think we have a good opportunity to work in the near term. The work isn't going to be limited to those, but this is how we can pull all that information together. And then we're going to be holding local meetings with collaborative groups, stakeholders, both in Columbine and in Dolores, looking at all lands, and then coming up in some of these priority pods with what is the work that needs to be done? What are the priorities that need to be addressed here? What are the major threats? Are there risks outside of the pods that we need to think about? And actually thinking about what is the strategy for this area of 35,000 acres and all the activities we want to complete over a 10-year period, so that this was ready, so that we were in some sort of a maintenance mode for this particular landscape, and then starting to build on that from there with other pods and other activities. Here's another example of Columbine 1. Both of these came out as a very high priority for the Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative. And so how are we going to do it? A lot of this is still a challenge of resources. It's a challenge of capacity. And one of the things that RMRI is unique in that it's not a kind of a traditional funding pool where you've got a pot of money and people put in proposals and you go after the money and then you check in later. If you get it, tell us how you did in a year. RMI is really meant to try and align, be a process of kind of pulling partners together to identify those shared values and those shared priorities from the state level all the way down to the local level. And in doing so, then we are informed in our individual investments that can be impactful and leveraged upon one another in these focused areas. And so it's really an effort of how do we identify some of those shared landscapes and really where we have discretion, focus resources that we can bring to bear on it, both of our staff and the funding that we can bring. We're also trying to align with things like the Restore program. That's the GOCO, NIFWIF, several organizations that are pooling funding to look at habitat improvement. The Southwest Wildfire Impact Fund here locally, that's a conservation finance group that I think many of you are familiar with. It's morphing and kind of connected to the work that was mentioned earlier with the Watershed Wildfire Protection Fund. And we're really excited to partner with SWIFT and the Watershed Wildfire Protection Fund to really look at those shared landscapes and how do we develop a strategy together. And hopefully we can leverage each other's resources and bring more to bear because of that shared strategy. The Colorado State Forest Service identified Southwest Colorado, you can see there in the bottom left, as a priority for their 10-year state forest action plan that was just signed. And then we've also got local collaboratives, local partners working together to put in proposals for 2 collaborative forest landscape restoration programs, which again would bring additional resources to do a lot of this work that has strong overlap with the Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative boundary. And that was really a lot of support and recognition goes out to those collaborative partners and stakeholders that really stepped up to help put in a really strong proposal that is now the #1 and #2 proposals in the country if we are awarded funding. So if that program gets congressionally allocated, then we're in a really strong position to get funding next year through that program. So in terms of projects and outcomes, what does this look like? You can see here all of the different entities that really are chipping in. This isn't what RMRI accomplished. This is RMRI telling the story of what all these partners in Southwest Colorado are accomplishing. And this isn't comprehensive, but just an example. The green dots are the Forest Service. We were able to do about 22 projects last year and over 25,000 acres towards those 4 values. We have Montrose Forest Products, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the City of Durango, Wildfire Adaptive Partners, NRCS, Colorado State Forest Service. Again, all chipping in. Combined, they did projects over 2,000 acres in Southwest Colorado and benefiting over 135 landowners, which is really cool when you start to look at this together, right? You look at one kind of subset of it, but it really takes that kind of landscape scale look of big, large-scale forest restoration combined with local efforts to create defensible space, to do water improvement projects, to do recreation infrastructure. All of those things combined are really what we're trying to look at. So here's what it looks like in the numbers. Cumulative total was over 23,000 acres on forest, 2,000 acres on non-federal lands, and 26,000 acres across the board. And you can see the benefits to each of those categories in terms of the breakdowns above. That puts us on track. We were aiming for about 30,000 acres a year over a 10-year period. And so in 2020, we were close to hitting that mark. We might be a little less this year because of the wildfire season and our inability to use fire, but we're still pulling that information together. And so that's kind of it. I know that's a lot of information, but I'll just pause there and see if there are questions on. I know there's kind of what is RMRI, what isn't it? If you have questions about CFLRP, I'm happy to answer whatever I'm able to. So thank you.
Looks like,
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
go ahead.
Heather, do you want to ask your question? Go ahead.
Thanks. I actually have a couple of things. I was curious if going back to the beginning, when you looked at those 4 challenge areas or barriers that the subcommittees were formed around, what is social license?
Yeah, that's a good question. The social license is our ability to kind of our public support for being able to do the work that needs to be done. So that includes forest thinning and work that say through timber industry. That includes prescribed fire and smoke impacts. That includes working in areas of high recreation, usage, those kinds of things. Is in a lot of places, social license is one of the biggest barriers. For example, on the Front Range in the Upper South Platte, being able to utilize prescribed fire there is a really difficult challenge. They don't have the social license, the community support to be able to use fire at a scale that's meaningful in terms of the relative to the threat. And so social license is really working with communities, working with stakeholders to build the support for the type of work that we think needs to be done.
Okay, and then just for clarification, so when you talked about that sort of 30,000 or 40,000 acre capacity to mitigate wildfire, compared to that almost or nearly 500,000 acres of what's out there, were you saying that is that the goal, that you're going to work at this 30 to 40,000 acre capacity for the next 10 years? Or were you saying that that's an issue because we can only, and were you referring to just the San Juan National Forest? So by, all this collaboration, it will expand that capacity. Could you just clarify?
Yeah, so that number statewide, we have almost 400,000 acres a year on average that are impacted by wildfires and insects and disease across the entire state. And across the entire state, the U.S. Forest Service is averaging about 30 to 40,000 acres of treatment across the to mitigate wildfire impacts. So think wild and urban interface treatments, forest health treatments around insects and disease, infrastructure protection. So it's very, we're very low in terms of the amount of work we're doing statewide relative to kind of the pace that the forests are being impacted. But that also, the confusing part was that it also coincides. Our goal here that we initially set, and we're refining those goals, was about 30,000 acres a year just in Southwest Colorado that we're aiming to try and work. And so those numbers are the same. So that's confusing, but that was referring to the statewide number in that earlier part.
Awesome. Okay, and then finally, just kudos for all this work it made when we did our comprehensive economic development strategy. Every community in the 5 regions that we support and work with had as priority projects ones related to wildfire mitigation, forest health, water, and beetle or insect infestation. And so by referencing our MRI, it was helpful for us to have a common language around looking at the goals for the next 2 years. And your acknowledgement of the local work that's been done is much appreciated in our communities, like with Dwarf and such. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. And our MRI wouldn't have landed here if there wasn't already a bunch of amazing work happening. That way it wasn't trying to start from scratch. It was trying to identify places that already had a lot of the foundation, and to try and be able to provide the resources and focus to kind of take that next step and for those groups to reach their goals. And I also wanted to point out too, because this is often thought of as, is it just a forest restoration, fire kind of thinning type project? And it's not. It's really meant to be outcome focused. And so the water outcome, for example, that we have drafted is having secure, clean water and delivery systems for local communities, agriculture users, and water-based recreation. There's more to it, but I just wanted to mention that reaching that outcome can be achieved through several different means, and it's a combination of our forest restoration work, but also in-stream work, also pollutants, also how we get there is less important than that we are able to reach the outcome in the best way we can. So I just want to make sure those other kind of activities, improving recreation sites, improving water kind of delivery systems, those things are all on the table in terms of getting to those outcomes.
Thanks so much, Jason. Peter, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, it's actually pretty closely related to what you were just saying, Jason, and that is, I think one of those slides said there was about 3,000 acres that were treated or dealt with in some way or fashion related to water. Could you kind of give some examples of what those types of projects were?
Yeah, and so a lot of that work was oriented around our kind of large scale forest restoration work in watersheds. So upper watershed, reducing potential sedimentation, potential kind of watershed improvement through forest restoration. And so the majority of those were in that category. In what we're looking at down in the future, and I think Shauna may be on and she could speak to it more if there's more in-depth questions, are looking at things like our watershed condition framework, and how do we move from kind of a damaged or impaired watershed and change that, improve that condition class over time through a series of activities, including forest restoration, but also including other elements. And so we're trying to really build in some of those other factors and tools into this, but initially most of that was upper watershed forest restoration.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, Marcia.
Yeah, Jason, this is really exciting. Thank you. I wanted to just let you know that, gosh, I think in the next 4 to 5 weeks, La Plata County and the city of Durango and Durango Fire will be acting on an intergovernmental agreement. It's not a new entity. It's an intergovernmental agreement to form the Wildfire and Watershed Protection Fund. And what we want to do, of course, working collaboratively with everybody, is to attract funds to work on the other side of the fence from where public entities are working. And Aaron Kemple and I think Aaron's on this call, has been working with us around how we get one map that we can all somehow interact with that says, like, where's CPW working? Where are the feds working? Where would private landowners be working, so we can be coordinated about that? The city has put in about 130,000. We've done the same and more. We are going to be hiring a position that will be housed at the county to do this. So, we have a lot of collaboration to do, and hopefully can meet with you soon just to understand how we can stitch these two efforts together. But pretty soon will be an actual, intergovernmental agreement will be signed by all the entities. And the Durango Fire is going to be responsible for the mitigation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And we're super excited about your work. And I think we're both at a really, it's perfect timing to be able to come together with where we're at in our process, and then really look at a more focused level and kind of what you're looking at as in terms of priorities, and being able to, I think we will be very successful in terms of leveraging resources on the federal and non-federal side in focusing in these places that are of shared priority and interest.
Thank you. And I do want to give a big shout out to the SWIFT team, who helped really inspire us and push us. And we wouldn't have this new project if it wasn't for the SWIFT effort. So we look forward to working with all of you once we get this up and going. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Marcia. That is really exciting. Are there any other questions for Jason before we move on? I think we're gonna go ahead. Thank you so much, Jason. That was a wonderful presentation. Really great to hear about the RMRI. Oh, Mandy, go ahead.
I did see Commissioner Matzelko raise your hand briefly, but didn't know if you still had a question, Matt.
No, I was just applauding with everyone's team effort on this this work. So thank you all.
Thanks, Matt. I guess I personally had a question. Jason, you did show a few slides of kind of some priority areas related to those water values that have kind of come up through the pod prioritization. Can you remind the group of where those areas are?
Yeah, so the some of the highest priority areas for water on the Columbine side were the Vallecito, Lemon, Tween Lakes, Upper Florida. That was definitely a high water priority. And then there was also water interests in both the Junction Creek and kind of that corridor going up towards Electra Lake. And I know that Hermosa Creek is a priority for, I believe, for this group. It's also a high priority for, I mentioned, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. And for example, that area is just outside of one of those pod focal areas, but we, again, we're looking at using all of the resources we can bring to bear on kind of those different priorities. And so those were some of the ones off the top of my head that I remember being a high priority for water, and several of those also have that combined, opportunity to work on recreation and community protection and water in the same place, which is really, when we can do that in an integrated way, we have a lot more opportunity in terms of resources, but also in terms of outcomes.
Thanks. That's really,
I think
Yes.
3 or 4 of the highest priority pods in the whole area were right there in the Columbine, kind of zone that we've been talking about.
thanks. Yeah, because I think it's really amazing to see, like you said, this landscape effort, and just a reminder that that can feel overwhelming sometimes, and feel like where do local folks fit, or a lot of local folks fit in that puzzle. But just a reminder, like there's cool work just within our backyard that is really being floating to the top of priorities, and cool work could be happening very soon. So,
Yeah, definitely.
thanks so much.
Yeah,
Jason.
and thanks again for inviting us to talk.
Thanks so much. Okay, next up, we are going to hear from Warren Ryder on a couple of different topics, both the stream management plan and Florida River projects. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, everybody. So just a quick update. I don't have slides to present. A very brief sort of update on the couple of things that Animas Watershed Partnership has going on right now. I'll start with the Florida. We over the last year and a half or so, we've been working through with the Bureau of Reclamation on identification of restoration opportunities within the Florida, below Lemon Dam, down to the confluence with the Animas. This the project involves sort of a look at water quality data, historical and aerial photos to look at where water quality data matched up with properties that were impacted heavily. This is just phase 1, sort of an identification phase. And then, ultimately phase 2 will be reaching out to landowners and actually doing on the ground projects. That said, during the process of identification, we did have one landowner who became aware of the project step forward and say, hey, can we sign up for this? Can we do some on the ground improvements? And that's the Palmer Ranch facility, which you're all pretty familiar with on the Florida, I think, with their horseback rides. Kelly's with the Forest Service and her husband's a physics professor up at the fort. So needless to say, they're science minded and they're very forward thinking in terms of how to manage that property. And we just met out there last week to see what we could get going on the ground this fall, take advantage of, cross your fingers, some residual moisture from winter snowfall. And that project ultimately does exclusion fencing throughout their property so that the horses don't impact the Florida, and then also moves the more high intensive uses of their horse operation away from the river corridor up into the upland areas rather than down in the riparian corridor. So we're going to start with the fencing of moving horses out of the riparian and do some reseeding this fall. And then we'll get back in to finish the fencing and reseeding with some irrigation improvements in the spring. So that's where we are on the Florida. That's the little project that AWP is taking on right now. And some of you I see some names on here of people who were in the stream management planning workshop a couple of weeks ago that the ARC Forum put on. And AWP we raised our hand to be the fiscal sponsor to develop a stream management plan, explore that for the Animas River Basin. I'm frantically working with some folks on this call to put together the first of several grant proposals to try to fund phase 1 of a plan. And phase 1, we decided would be a scoping phase only. No plan, no predetermined outcomes at this point. This is really an opportunity over the next year and a half to, bring all of you and many others to the table to ask what's important in the Animas. What should we be planning for? What should our scope be? Should it be looking at reaches where we know we can have a significant impact today, or should we be looking broader scale at the entire watershed or some big portion of it to sort of drive a longer term holistic view of the watershed, or is that too much to wrap our hands around? Nothing's been predetermined, and it's up to stakeholders in our basin to help guide us on where that plan's going to end up ultimately. And so fingers crossed we get some funding to come through and we can get this started. I don't know if folks have questions about that process. It's been done in quite a few basins in Colorado, and someone like Stacy can probably speak to how many how many have been done in the state. The upper MSI and Arc Forum are working on one in the upper San Juan right now. There's been one done on, I can't remember if it's finished yet or not, on the San Miguel. I believe the Mancus is working on one as well. So, you know, we're going to try to piggyback on some of the great work and lessons learned in the other basins around here to develop a plan. So I'm looking forward to working with probably everyone on this call at some point in the next year and a half on this plan.
Warren, can you give folks kind of a timeline? I know you're in the applying for funding phase.
Yeah. So right now, there are several grant sort of application windows that are quickly closing between now and the end of the year. So, you know, knock on wood that we receive funding through those mechanisms. The proposal right now is to get started in sort of mid to late winter, going through with an 18-month process. So going through sort of mid 2023 to scope what a plan might look like, what we want to try to wrap our hands around. And then, you know, hopefully as the sort of the idea is to develop that scope through the stakeholder process, and then in 2023 really start getting into the weeds on what a plan might look like for the Animas.
Thanks, Warren. Are there any questions from anyone in the group? And I just want to remind you, if you did come to our July meeting, we did talk about the concept of what a stream management plan looks like. And we had River Network present. Stacy Bowe helped co-present on that. Go ahead, Laura. What's your question?
Oh, yeah. Hi, and thanks, Warren and Animas Watershed Partnership for being willing to take on the grant application process. This might have come up at the workshop. I was just kind of curious, thinking about it afterwards, if there were other stream management plans around the state that were at state line or addressed a basin that hit state line, and then kind of how those stream management plans incorporated stakeholders from other states, given that this funding is really from CWCB and state-based.
Yeah, so I'm not aware of, you know, obviously the upper San Juan, the San Juan flows into New Mexico. And there are people on this call that can address that better than I can. I don't know how they approach that. I can speak to sort of AWP's thoughts around that. I'm really interested in having a stream management plan that crosses the boundary and includes the entire basin. If it's determined by the stakeholder process that the scope isn't sort of a reach specific scope. To do an effort this big and exclude part of the basin, if that's what we decide to do, seems a little short-sighted to me. The neat thing is that when we were speaking with the CWCB during that call, any money that comes from New Mexico can be counted as a match against CWCB grants. It's specifically that CWCB money itself cannot be used to look at New Mexico reaches of the watershed. So, you know, we can easily get creative with the fundraising, I think, to make sure that New Mexico portions of the Animas watershed are included in whatever plan we develop. And that's, you know, at least going in, that's my intent, is to make sure that those stakeholders are included in that section of the watershed is included.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. And I saw some chat messages. I mean, I should have thought of this. Sorry, that was my to me. The Mancus, the San Juan. I guess I wasn't quite aware and haven't been as listening in on those processes as much to know that, you know, they're as integrated with New Mexico entities as maybe we are on the Animas. So it's an interesting question and an important one. I'll just be following.
Yeah, so much great work has been done on the New Mexico side as well. So I think it's important that we bring it all in for a holistic approach. Thanks, Laura.
Stacy, I saw your response there in the chat. So we do have Stacy, who is can act as our coach as we navigate these kinds of questions.
So River Network is supporting all 26 SMPs that are going on in the state in various ways. And we actually have like an online community of all the SMP leaders that I know Mandy and others are involved in. So I'll pose this question. I honestly, just from what I understand, which isn't that much, that the collaboration happening across state lines in the Animas is pretty awesome compared to a lot of places. So I would suspect that there may not be other examples, and you all are pretty much a leader in that. But it'll be interesting to hear what others have to say.
Thanks for that. So I have an announcement related to all of this that so Warren is working on the first grant, as he mentioned, right now to go to the Southwest Basin Roundtable. And most of you here are in the nonprofit world in some respect and know that when you write grants, you often ask for letters of support from your partners to show either support of concept or actually financial support and in-kind support. And so the Animas River Community Forum is going to submit a letter of support for Animas Watershed Partnerships application. And I wanted to let everyone here today know about that because basically we're representing all of you as stakeholders and members of this community forum. I'm going to briefly share my screen here. Just a moment. Where is my PowerPoint? I'm so sorry. I have a million tabs open as always.
It's okay. As you're pulling that up, I would say we have drafted a letter and we wanted to see if anyone was opposed to us submitting a letter of support on behalf of, because there are many partners involved in the Animas River Community Forum. MSI helps coordinate it. We're just one person. So please let us know if anyone's opposed to us submitting that. We want to make sure that we're representing your voice as well and showing your support if you feel that way. But be considerate that some may want us to not. So go ahead, Amanda.
Thanks, Mandy. That's a good counterpoint that yeah, we don't have to go along with this, but the letter, rather than put up a letter for everyone to read, I made a quick slide with the major points of what we're saying as the Animas River Community Forum, and that's that we've demonstrated support for going forward with an SMP for the Animas River watershed, and that at our last meeting, as I mentioned, we did present to all of you kind of what a stream management plan looks like, what that process could be, and had a few different representatives from nearby watershed groups to talk about how it's working so far. So Mandy, you know, as we mentioned, had been working on the Upper San Juan with her group. I think Steve Monroe had spoken up at that time about the Mancus process and how that was going. And so hopefully some of you remember that we introduced the concept there. And after kind of presenting it at the meeting of what SMPs are and how the state is going forward with those across the state for the Colorado Water Plan, we wanted to see who wanted to lead the process, who wanted to be involved in the process. At that time, Warren spoke up and said AWP would like to lead the process. And then that led to the September 29th workshop that was held. And so Mandy had put in the chat, we are going to get that recording of that workshop if you didn't make it and wanted to know more about it. And then looking forward, you know, so AWP is taking the lead. They'll convene meetings and sessions for scoping and hire a facilitator for that. Animas River Community Forum can provide in-kind support and making sure that all of these different stakeholders and partners in our watershed know about what's going on. And as that process moves forward and evolves, there may be openings for different engagement that people can step into. So we want to make you aware of those opportunities and you know, recruit future partners as that scope progresses, the scoping process progresses. So I guess I wasn't really planning on doing a vote or anything like that. Please put into the chat if there's anything in this letter of support that you're opposed to, feel free to reach out to me privately via email, but or put in the chat right now. And you can also raise your hand if you'd like to speak up at this time.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks. And then does anyone have any further questions for Warren about moving forward with the SMP? Okay, at this point in time, we are going to move to our community forum partner updates. This is the part of the meeting that really brings us together as a community, where each of you are welcomed to offer your update from your part of the world. We have a few people that have already told us that they had updates, so we are going to start with Jordan Dimmick to tell us some updates about the 416 Fire Watershed Restoration Project.
Great, thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you all for giving me a couple minutes. I'm happy to report that the La Plata County put out an RFP in this middle of the summer for a contractor to construct the designed project. So we got a couple of proposals, selected Winery Construction. He did some of the emergency watershed protection project work here. So he's under contract, and we've got some final designs that we've gotten to him, and we're getting bids. The first projects that will be constructed possibly later this month or early next will be in the Falls Creek area. There's a couple of drainages that have continued to run with the monsoons this summer. And so we've designed some stabilization techniques and methods in the channel, and doing work there with them. And then we've got our survey completed in a couple of spots in the upper portion of the valley, working with landowners on some sedimentation basins to collect debris and materials that will come in. Hoping to get those finalized here this month and get Stan working on those afterwards. And then we're currently helping La Plata County and the U.S. Forest Service kind of work through agreements so that we can do the culvert work we plan. I always forget the Forest Service road. Let me double check. The 576 up to Hermosa Creek Trailhead. And so we've got 7 culvert replacement modification projects planned to help the drainages there. So we're in the work and hoping to get a lot of stuff done before winter sets in. So that's a quick update.
Thanks, Jordan. Excited to see that progress happening. Any questions for Jordan? Jimbo.
Hey, Jordan.
Hey, Jimbo.
Just, I know you're quite good at this, but can you be sure you give heads up to like the ditch companies about your work? I know for Hermosa Ditch, we have some work this fall, and just want to be sure we're coordinated with you on any projects. So that's all. Thanks.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Jimbo.
I just wanted to add that the work SGM is planning to do in Falls Creek helps ensure the filtration operation through several hundred acres of meadows and forest land, improving the water quality in the Animas Valley and our lake.
Thanks, Clyde. Is there anybody else that has a question for Jordan? All right, that's been a long process. I'm glad to see it going into action. Next, I'd love to hear from Marcel about the outstanding waters.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Amanda. And hi, everybody. My name is Marcel Gazdenbeid. I'm a hydrogeologist that works as the Animas River Keeper for San Juan Citizens Alliance. I think I'm lucky to know most of you on the call. I'm going to just provide a quick overview and update about an exciting project we're working on with a bunch of partners, including Mountain Studies Institute, American Rivers, American Whitewater. Don't want to miss anybody, so I have a list here. Trout Unlimited, Conservation Colorado, High Country Conservation Advocates, the Pew Charitable Trust, and Western Resource Advocates. And I don't have any slides, but I will share my screen here. It's been disabled for screen sharing. Sorry.
I can help you. Hang on. Sorry.
There we go. I got it.
Oh, thanks.
Cool. So we are working on a project with a group that I just mentioned, and Mountain Studies Institute's been extremely helpful in this effort. I don't have to tell this crowd, but the Upper Animas watershed is a heavily forested area that benefits from the high quality water coming out of the high country, off the forest generally, but from the Wimmanooch and Hermosa Creek Wilderness area specifically, that flow into the main stem of the Animas. And what we're working on here in the Animas Basin and alongside partners in the Dolores, the Gunnison, and the San Juan is placing new anti-degradation protections on high quality streams through a process known as Outstanding Waters designation. If you're unfamiliar with Outstanding Waters, and apologies in advance, I know many of you on the call have already heard from me or one of my colleagues about this project, but the Clean Water Act essentially gives individual states the authority to designate special protections on pristine waterways to make sure that water quality is not degraded. Existing outstanding waters in Colorado, which I can show you on this map. Here is all the blue on this map across the state. They only exist in designated wilderness areas or protected parks across the state, which was done by default when those wilderness designations were made, with the exception of Hermosa Creek down here. Let me zoom in on our neck of the woods. Hermosa Creek is the only outstanding water in the state of Colorado that does not exist in a wilderness or state or federal park already. The decision to designate outstanding waters is made by the Colorado Water Quality Control Commission, and it depends on specific criteria like water quality, outstanding natural resource values like aquatic habitat or recreational use, and community support for enhanced protection, also super important. Essentially, anti-degradation policy in the state of Colorado has 3 tiers for water quality protection. On the low end, there's use protected waters, where water is allowed to be degraded down to water quality standards. In the middle, there's reviewable, where we work to meet the standards or be better than the standards. And then outstanding waters is the top end. It's the highest level of protection afforded a water body in the state. And it essentially means the state sees value in maintaining water quality in a stream at its current pristine state in the long term. So we started working on this process in 2019, so a couple years ago, to identify potential candidate streams, collect that water quality data, which is where MSI comes in. Huge thank you to Scott Roberts, especially for leading that effort, and perform outreach to important stakeholders. And some of the Animas tributary streams that we're looking at, which I will zoom in on here. You can see it's the red here. Again, thank you to Scott for putting this map together for us. That'd be of interest to this group, and apologies, again, I know I've spoken to a lot of you about this already, but we're looking at Boulder and Bear Creek up here in Silverton. Let me zoom in. At the headwaters of the Animas up there, Cascade Creek and Lime Creek further down the hill, partially in La Plata County, and then Grasshopper Creek, which is fully in La Plata County, which is down here. All these other streams coming out of the Wimmanooch, as I mentioned, are already outstanding waters, and Grasshopper is just kind of an outlier here, where it starts in the Wimmanooch, but then it was not designated as outstanding waters because it wasn't in the boundary. So 4 of the 5 streams that we're looking at for potential outstanding waters protection exist entirely on U.S. Forest Service land, and 1 is entirely on Bureau of Land Management land. That's a Boulder Creek up in Silverton. And we're looking at these streams essentially because they're excellent, they're outstanding. They provide critical aquatic habitat for native trout, macroinvertebrates, birds, and other wildlife. We have cutthroat trout in Grasshopper Creek, for example. Oh, whoops, sorry, my map's freaking out. There we go. We have cutthroat trout in Grasshopper Creek. The American Dipper Project monitors nesting sites for that species along Cascade Creek. The streams also contribute significantly to downstream resilience of the Animas, so functional assimilative capacity of the river and the ecosystem services that the Animas provides, like drinking water or irrigation water. Buffering capacity against events like wildfire, like we saw with 416, or human pollution, like the Gold King mine spill. And they also have outstanding recreational value, including existing uses for fishing, swimming, paddling. I personally hunt, fish, and paddle in these watersheds. And most importantly, the water quality is excellent. We found these streams have water quality above and beyond existing standards across all flow regimes. We've been sampling 3 or 4 times a year across all of these different areas for a couple of years now. So sorry, I'm trying to get through this quickly because I only had a little bit here on the agenda. But we're a little more than halfway through the process, essentially, doing a lot of outreach, which has included San Juan and La Plata County commissioners, water rights holders, such as the town of Silverton. Boulder and Bear Creek up here are actually the town of Silverton's source water, where they get all their drinking water. Excel Energy, for example, is another important stakeholder we've been talking to. They operate the diversion for Electra Lake and the Tacoma Power Station. discharge permit holders such as Purgatory Resort. We've been talking to them. We're also operating on a Forest Service research permit, so keeping the Forest Service in the loop, and keeping close touch with the Colorado Department of Transportation too, since these streams go under Highway 550. That outreach is still ongoing, but we're making really good progress. The Forest Service, for example, has been especially helpful recently. They rightfully pointed out that Cascade Creek, for the last year or maybe more than a year, the lower part of Cascade, water has not been diverted as usual into Electra Lake. They've been doing maintenance there. So the water quality conditions, which were perfect in Lower Cascade and matched what we saw in Upper Cascade, might not be representative of baseline conditions. And so we're likely to remove Lower Cascade from our proposal for that reason. We just didn't actually capture the water quality data that we needed there. So again, thank you to the Forest Service for that important feedback. But other than that, water quality looks great across all of the other regions. And I think I'll stop there in case anybody has any questions. Again, huge thanks to MSI for leading our water quality effort, which is the most critical piece probably for the whole effort. And yeah, the kind of where we are in the process, there are 3 hearings before the Water Quality Control Commission. We've done one already, which was last year. We have another one this November, the issues formulation hearing. And then the final rulemaking hearing will be June of next year. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. And if folks have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Marcel, do you have links or dates for that November hearing so folks can listen in and learn more, or websites or things that they can learn more about this process? Because I know
whoops, sorry, just realized that you're talking to a picture of me. Yes, I can post the I can do it in the chat, the link to the Water Quality Control Commission's long range schedule. I do know that the upcoming hearing is November 8th. It's a Monday. So that's the next hearing. And then I don't know the exact day, but it's June 2022 for the rulemaking. But let me get the long range schedule and I'll post that in the chat. And then I might also just drop my email and my phone number. If folks have questions, I'm happy to talk about this with anybody. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Marcel. We're going to let anybody with questions follow up via email with Marcel so we can keep moving. Elaine Chick is going to update us on the Basin Implementation Plan and the roundtable.
Hey, thank you. Great updates, everybody. Thanks. I just want to let everyone know that the updated Basin Implementation Plan documents are now out for public comment as of today. Public comment will go on through November 15th, and then feedback will be delivered to each basin for consideration. You can go on to the engagecwcb.org. I'll put that in the chat in a minute. And just click, it's right on the first page there. And you can look at all of the basin implementation plans from all of the basins. And there's been a lot of work in the Southwest Basin from the contractor, Carrie, that put together. So you can look at the documents on volume 1 and volume 2 for the Southwest Basin and put in your comments. So I invite you to do that. And also the regular roundtable meeting is coming up October 28th. You're all invited to please participate in the Southwest Basin Roundtable. The information and link will be on the Roundtable tab on the Water Information Program website. I will put both of those links in the chat for you. But just wanted to let everybody know it's exciting that these BIPs are now out for public consumption and review. So please, I invite you all to take a look at that and comment if you'd like. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That's great. We'll look forward to that. Let's see. Okay, we've got a lot of things in the chat, so please take a look at that. And then Alyssa, would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'll keep it short. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to provide an update. I'm Melissa Richmond. I'm the program coordinator for the San Juan Watershed Group in Aztec and San Juan Basin in New Mexico. So I wanted to give you guys a quick update what's going downriver. So the San Juan Watershed Group, we have been working on implementing the Lower Animas Watershed-based plan, and we have 6 agriculture BMP projects that we have close to finishing. A lot of different varieties, solar livestock wells, rotational grazing and cover cropping systems, a pasture French drain system, and a spare fire restoration project. So those have been going well for the past year. And then we also have our scoping work for a restoration plan for the Middle San Juan, specifically between Canyon Largo and Shiprock area on the San Juan. And we have so many partners that have been helping out with that. NMED, Bureau of Land Management, State Land Office, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, Diné College, Diné Environmental Institute. We're looking at a plan that's looking at several different factors with bacteria, impairments that are on the San Juan, safe fish passage, recreation, non-native phreatophyte removal and restoration. We're looking on having a draft of that plan done by summer of next year, and with the goal of having this be not EPA 9 key element plan by 2023. So just wanted to give you guys that update.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have time for one more partner update, and then I'll ask anybody else that has an update to put their information in the chat. And thanks to Kara and Elaine for putting information about how to comment on the implementation plan in the chat. So please see those. Does anybody else have another update? Okay, if you think of something later, please feel free to email us and we will put it in the newsletter when we give the update on the notes. I just want to wrap up by saying this was our third of 3 meetings in 2021. So we're here at the end of our Animas River Community Forum year. We've covered a lot and kind of looked from large scale down to more regional scales and really local scales. And I think it's really exciting that out of this year, we've got momentum going forward to start a stream management plan for our area. So thank you to everyone who's made it to all of our meetings and shared your time with us and shared your updates with us. We couldn't do this without you. Really grateful. We have a steering committee that kind of helps us set the agenda for the year. And so we'll be getting them together again soon to look at what we want to do as a group in 2022 and how we want to continue moving forward. One of our big elements to finish up this year is the Our Animas document update, and we're going to continue to work with Marcel and the rest of the Education and Outreach Committee subcommittee to get that across the finish line. Again, we'll continue to send out newsletters and notes and keep everyone up to date on events and news in our watershed. So when you have something to share, please let us know and we'll get it into that newsletter. That's our key way of keeping us all connected outside of these meetings, which are just 3 times a year and pretty periodic. So please keep that in mind and please make sure you open our emails. Mandy works hard on those. Lastly, we'll be sending out at the beginning of 2022 a request for membership donations if you want to donate to keep this group operating and be one of the sponsors of the forum. So look for that form to hit your inbox sometime at the beginning of the new calendar year. But thank you all so much. 4:59, we did it. We stayed on time. Thanks everyone. Yeah, any other comments, feel free to put them in the chat, and thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Glad to see a cat there, Marcia, a black cat no less.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks all.
Amanda and Artemis, you want to hang on for so long?
Sure.